He walked into the lecture hall with nothing but a notebook, a sharpened pencil, and a dream. But before the first equation hit the board, the professor's eyes locked on him not with curiosity, but with judgment. Whispers floated through the rows. A single smirk from the front of the room told him this wasn't going to be a normal class. And when the test began, it was clear. This wasn't about calculus at all. What happened next would shatter expectations, challenge prejudice, and leave the entire room speechless. Malik Johnson had always been the quiet achiever. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, he spent countless nights hunched over library books, solving problems most adults wouldn't dare touch. His love for numbers wasn't just a talent, it was an escape, a way to see the world through patterns and logic instead of chaos and prejudice. By the time he earned a scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country, he'd already beaten the odds stacked against him. It was the start of a new semester, and Malik was determined to prove himself in his advanced calculus course, the kind of class that could open doors to graduate programs and research opportunities. He arrived early, taking a seat near the front, ready to learn. Around him, students chatted casually, scribbling equations on their tablets, unaware that Malik's journey to that seat had been anything but easy. What Malik didn't know was that this day, in this very classroom, his skills wouldn't be the only thing put to the test. Something far more personal was about to unfold, something that would challenge more than just his knowledge of mathematics. The lecture hall buzzed as the professor strode in, a tall man in a crisp suit, his every movement sharp, deliberate. Without a greeting, he began scrawling a string of complex equations across the board, symbols that twisted and curled like a foreign language. Malik leaned forward, eager to follow along. But before he could even open his notebook, the professor's voice cut through the room. "You there," he said, pointing straight at Malik. "Come solve this." A few students glanced up, surprised. Malik hesitated, unsure if he'd heard correctly. This was the first minute of the first class. No context, no warm-up, just an order. Slowly he rose, feeling dozens of eyes tracking him as he made his way to the board. The problem stared back at him, a monstrous equation, clearly advanced beyond what had been covered so far. Malik's pulse quickened. It wasn't impossible, but it was meant to intimidate. He could feel it. From the back of the room came a faint chuckle. Someone whispered, "This'll be good." Malik didn't need to turn around to know. They were watching for him to fail. He gripped the chalk, the cool dust pressing into his fingertips. His mind raced not just with numbers, but with the weight of the moment. Was this really about testing knowledge? Or proving a point? The professor crossed his arms, his tone dripping with condescension. "Take your time. We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself." Something in those words dug deep. Pulling up memories, Malik thought he'd buried teachers who assumed he was in the wrong class, strangers who questioned how he could afford tuition, classmates who acted surprised when he spoke intelligently. This was different, though. This was public, deliberate. He began writing, his movement steady but his chest tight. The equations flowed in his head, each step unfolding with clarity, but every time his chalk paused, the silence grew heavier, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Halfway through, he heard the professor mutter under his breath, "Just loud enough? We'll see if you really belong here." The words were gasoline on a fire. Malik's focus sharpened, the numbers clicking into place faster now. But before he could finish, the professor stepped forward, tapping the board with the chalk. "Are you sure about that step? Seems ambitious." Malik knew the step was right, but challenging the professor now would make the tension explode. Around him, the whispers grew louder. Then came the twist. The professor took the chalk from Malik's hand and turned to the class. "Can anyone correct this?" he asked. The air froze. Malik's stomach dropped. This wasn't a test anymore, it was a spectacle. And just when it seemed like the humiliation was complete, Malik noticed something in the corner of the board, a hidden detail the professor hadn't spotted, a detail that could change everything. Malik's eyes locked on that small, almost invisible symbol in the corner of the equation, a notation mistake so subtle, most would miss it. But it wasn't his mistake. It was the professor's. The entire problem, the one meant to humiliate him, had been written wrong from the start. In a flash, the pieces fit together. This wasn't about testing skill. It was about setting a trap. And he had just found the flaw in it. The room felt smaller now, the air electric with tension. Students leaned forward, sensing something was about to break. Malik turned slowly toward the professor, his voice calm but steady. "There's an error in the problem," he said, tapping the chalk against the board. "Right here." The professor stiffened, the color draining slightly from his face. "That's not possible," he muttered, but Malik didn't stop. He walked the class through the correction, each step crisp and undeniable. The math unfolded flawlessly, the numbers snapping into place like a puzzle only he could solve. By the time he reached the solution, the silence in the room was deafening. Every eye shifted from Malik to the professor. The smirks were gone. The whispers had stopped. And for the first time, Malik saw something in the professor's expression, not respect, not apology, but something closer to fear. But just as the weight of his victory began to sink in, the professor leaned in, lowering his voice so only Malik could hear. "You think this changes anything? You'll still never belong here." The words hit harder than any public humiliation, because in that moment Malik realized this wasn't about a single math problem. It was about an entire system, one that could twist truth into a weapon and still walk away unchallenged. And as he stood there, chalk dust still on his fingers, the question burned in his mind if proving himself beyond doubt wasn't enough. What would be? Malik returned to his seat, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline, but his mind clearer than ever. The classroom had changed in those few minutes. Students now looked at him, not as the target of ridicule, but as someone who had refused to be silenced. The professor sank back into his chair, a rare silence filling the room where arrogance once reigned. For Malik, the victory wasn't just solving a math problem. It was a statement that talent, intelligence, and worth cannot be measured by bias, and that courage can expose injustice even in the smallest arenas. Yet he also knew the truth: one equation, corrected in one lecture, Hall doesn't dismantle years of prejudice. The battle wasn't over. It never would be, not fully. Walking out of that classroom, Malik felt a mix of triumph and solemn awareness. He had proven himself, but the system that had tried to humiliate him still existed, quietly in countless other rooms, workplaces, and neighborhoods. His story was just one voice, against a chorus of bias that, too, often goes unheard, and as he stepped into the sunlight, the question lingered in his mind, and should linger for all of us. How many more talented, brilliant minds are overlooked, dismissed, or humiliated simply because of the color of their skin? How many more will have to fight not just for knowledge, but for respect and dignity? Malik's journey didn't end with a single victory. It became a reminder, a challenge to everyone watching, to notice, to question, and to act against the subtle, pervasive injustices that shape lives every day. Because if we look away, the story doesn't end, it repeats. And the question remains: when will the world finally change?